Ollie McGraw's story is often remembered as a Hollywood fairy tale that quietly unraveled. To the world, she appeared almost suddenly radiant, elegant, and impossibly perfect on screen. She became the face of romantic tragedy through Love Story, a film that transformed her into a cultural symbol of fragile beauty and emotional longing. Yet behind that carefully constructed image was a real woman navigating forces far larger than herself: fame, expectation, love, loss, and the relentless machinery of Hollywood. Her life was never just about stardom. It was about what happens when identity is shaped too quickly by external admiration, when a person becomes a symbol before they become fully grounded in who they are. The consequences can be quietly devastating. Ollie McGraw's journey reflects that tension between being seen and being understood. What makes her story endure is not just the glamour or the heartbreak, but the gradual stripping away of illusion. She was adored, then scrutinized, then slowly forgotten by the industry that once defined her. In that forgetting, however, something else emerged. A quieter truth about survival, reinvention, and the cost of being idealized. This is not simply a tale of fame, rising and fading. It is a reflection on vulnerability under the spotlight, on relationships shaped by imbalance, and on the long process of rebuilding a life after the world stops watching. Ollie McGraw's legacy is not frozen in her most famous role. It lives in everything that came after. The struggle, the withdrawal, and the eventual search for peace beyond recognition. The rise of a cultural icon, Love Story and instant immortality. When Love Story was released in 1970, it did more than succeed at the box office. It defined a generation's understanding of romance and heartbreak. At the center of it all was Ollie McGraw, whose performance as Jenny made her instantly unforgettable. She wasn't just acting. She embodied a feeling that audiences didn't fully understand, but deeply recognized. Her rise to fame was sudden and overwhelming. One moment she was working behind the scenes in fashion and media circles, and the next she was everywhere: posters, magazine covers, interviews, and public fascination. The world didn't just watch her, it projected onto her. She became a symbol of purity, tragedy, and unattainable love. But that kind of recognition is fragile. It doesn't leave much space for the human being behind the image. Ollie McGraw was no longer just a person navigating a career. She became a vessel for collective emotion. People didn't see her complexity, they saw what they wanted her to represent. Fame at that speed creates an illusion of permanence, but it often rests on unstable ground. The same audience that elevated her could shift focus just as quickly. And in Hollywood, where new faces are constantly introduced, permanence is rarely the reality. Still, at the height of Love Story, Ollie McGraw stood at the center of something larger than herself. She was admired, idealized, and immortalized in a way few actors ever experience. But beneath that moment of cultural stardom, the pressures of identity, expectation, and emotional isolation were already beginning to form. Before the spotlight, a life shaped by fragility and search for self long before fame arrived. Ollie McGraw's life was already marked by emotional complexity. She did not come from a world of stability or predictability. Her upbringing carried its own tensions, shaped by family instability and emotional distance that would later echo through her adult life. Before Hollywood fully claimed her, she was navigating smaller roles in the fashion world, working in environments where appearance often mattered more than emotional depth. Even there, she stood out not just for beauty, but for a certain quiet intensity that others noticed but rarely understood. This early period matters because it reveals something essential. She did not step into fame from a place of emotional security. Instead, she entered it while still forming her sense of identity. That makes the impact of sudden recognition far more complicated. Fame did not arrive after she had fully defined herself. It arrived while she was still searching. That search for self would later become central to her life story. Many people assume Hollywood success begins with confidence, but in her case, it was layered over uncertainty. She was admired before she had the chance to fully understand what she wanted, who she was becoming, or how to protect her inner world. This vulnerability is often invisible at the time of success. It only becomes clear later, when the external validation fades and what remains is the private self that was never fully nurtured under the spotlight. Hollywood's machinery, beauty, projection, and loss of identity. Hollywood has a way of turning people into symbols, and MacGraw became one of its most striking examples. Once she entered the industry's full attention, her identity began to shift. Not because she changed who she was, but because the world around her reshaped her meaning. She was no longer simply an actress, she became an image. That image was carefully maintained by studios, media, and public expectation. Her beauty was emphasized, her vulnerability romanticized, and her emotional presence interpreted through the lens of characters she portrayed. The problem with being turned into a symbol is that individuality begins to fade from public view. People stop asking who you are and start assuming they already know. For MacGraw, this meant living inside an identity that was partially constructed by others. Hollywood rewarded her presence but rarely engaged with her personhood. That imbalance creates a quiet, psychological strain. When admiration is tied to appearance or projected emotion rather than lived reality, it becomes difficult to separate self-worth from external validation. Over time, the pressure to maintain that image can become exhausting. There is little room for change, imperfection, or withdrawal. And yet, those are all natural parts of being human. MacGraw's early fame illustrates this tension clearly. She was celebrated for a version of herself that was never fully allowed to evolve in public. And as the industry moved forward, it left little space for her to step outside the frame it had created. Love, control, and the weight of relationships in the spotlight. MacGraw's personal life unfolded under the same spotlight that defined her career, and that made her relationships unusually exposed to public interpretation. Her marriage to producer Robert Evans placed her within one of Hollywood's most powerful circles. It was a union shaped as much by timing and status as by emotional depth. Later, her relationship with Steve McQueen introduced a different dynamic, one marked by intensity, control, and withdrawal from public life. McQueen, known for his strong personality and private nature, represented a shift away from Hollywood visibility. For MacGraw, this meant stepping further out of the professional world she had once inhabited so fully. Relationships under fame rarely exist in isolation. They are influenced by careers, public expectations, and personal insecurities magnified by constant attention. In her case, emotional dependency and identity blending became central themes. The boundaries between love and self-sacrifice blurred over time. Choosing intimacy often meant choosing distance from her own career and public identity. That shift is not uncommon among actors in high-profile relationships, but in her case, it carried lasting consequences. The gradual withdrawal from acting became not just a professional pause, but a restructuring of identity itself. When relationships end under such conditions, what remains is often not just heartbreak, but disorientation. The separation is not only from a partner, but from a version of life that had become deeply intertwined with self-perception. Collapse and withdrawal When the spotlight finally moves on as the years passed, Hollywood's attention inevitably shifted. New faces emerged, new stories took hold, and MacGraw, once central to cultural conversation, began to fade from the industry's immediate focus. This transition is often abrupt in entertainment, where relevance is closely tied to constant visibility. For someone who had been intensely visible, this fading can feel disorienting. The transition from being widely recognized to being occasionally remembered creates a psychological gap that is difficult to navigate. It is not just the loss of attention, but the loss of structure that fame provides. During this period, her life became more private, and with that privacy came challenges. Emotional strain, personal reflection, and coping mechanisms emerged in quieter, less visible ways. Like many who experience sudden shifts away from public life, she faced the difficult process of recalibrating identity outside external validation. What is often misunderstood about this stage is that it is not simply decline, it is adjustment. But adjustment without support can feel like collapse. The world sees absence, but the individual experiences internal reconstruction. MacGraw's withdrawal from Hollywood was not a single moment. It was a gradual stepping back from a system that had once defined her entirely. And in that space, she began confronting questions that fame had long postponed. Who she was without recognition, and what remained when the world stopped watching. Recovery and rebuilding. The quiet discipline of survival recovery in MacGraw's life did not arrive as a dramatic transformation. It came gradually through distance, reflection, and the decision to seek stability outside the environments that had shaped her earlier years. One of the most significant steps in this process was her time at the Betty Ford Clinic, where she confronted aspects of her life that had been long buried under professional image and emotional avoidance. There, the focus shifted away from public perception and toward personal honesty. What makes this phase important is not the narrative of fixing a life, but the process of learning to exist without external validation as the primary measure of worth. Recovery, in her case, was not about returning to fame or restoring a career. It was about rebuilding a sense of internal stability. This period also involved confronting long-standing emotional patterns, dependence, fear of abandonment, and the tendency to equate love with self-erasure. These are not quick realizations. They emerge slowly, often through quiet reflection rather than sudden insight. MacGraw's recovery was not performative. It was private, uneven, and deeply personal. And unlike the stories Hollywood prefers where redemption is fast and visible, hers unfolded in ways that were largely unseen. What emerged from this period was not a return to her former self, but the formation of a new one, less defined by external expectations and more grounded in personal awareness. Santa Fe and reinvention, choosing ordinary life over myth after leaving behind the intensity of Hollywood life. MacGraw eventually settled in Santa Fe, New Mexico. This move represented more than a change of scenery. It was a deliberate step away from the identity that fame had constructed around her. Santa Fe offered something she had rarely experienced in her earlier life: anonymity without loss of dignity. There, she was not a symbol, a headline, or a cinematic memory. She was simply a person living a quieter existence. Her daily life became centered on simplicity: walking, reading, reflection, and connection with nature. These routines may seem ordinary, but for someone who had lived under constant attention, they represented a profound shift. Reinvention, in this sense, does not mean becoming someone entirely new. It means shedding roles that no longer fit. For MacGraw, it meant stepping out of the expectations of Hollywood and into a life where she could exist without performance. Even in this quieter chapter, there is a sense of complexity. Peace does not erase memory. Reflection does not undo history, but it allows space for acceptance. Her later years reflect a different kind of strength, not the visible strength of fame, but the quieter resilience of someone who has learned to live without constant external validation. Conclusion: a life remembered beyond the frame. Ali MacGraw's story is often remembered through fragments, a film role, a moment of fame, a period of retreat. But those fragments do not fully capture the depth of her experience. Her life is not simply a rise and fall narrative. It is a study in visibility, vulnerability, and survival. She was shaped by a system that rewarded image over individuality, and she navigated its pressures with both grace and struggle. The world saw her beauty and success, but often missed the complexity behind them. What remains most significant about her journey is not the height of her fame, but what came after it. The quiet years, the withdrawal from public attention, and the gradual rebuilding of identity all reveal a different kind of strength, one that is rarely celebrated. Her story also reflects something broader about fame itself. It shows how quickly admiration can turn into distance, and how easily people can become symbols rather than individuals. Yet within that system, Ali MacGraw found something rare: the ability to step away, to choose a life not defined by constant recognition, but by personal peace. In the end, her legacy is not limited to cinema history. It lives in the space between what was seen and what was never fully understood. And perhaps that is why her story continues to resonate, not because it is only about loss, but because it is also about endurance, reflection, and the quiet decision to become whole on one's own terms.